Welcome to the Pursuit of Abstraction, an exhibition that originated at the Wolfsonian Museum and is currently at Artis-Naples at the Baker Museum, where we are now. So here we are, Pursuit of Abstraction, a wonderful exhibition curated by Matthew Appice from the Wolfsonian that explores the cultural response to the spiritual crisis of the modern age. So what do I really mean by that? We're going to discover that. Matthew, like myself, is not an art historian. And that's the great thing about the Wolfsonian. You don't have to be an art historian to tell this story. All the stories are told through paintings, sculpture, fine arts, chairs, objects. And Matthew has used the lens of two collectors, myself, a collector of women modernists, and my uncle, who is not a collector. He will identify himself, and that's Mickey Wolfson, as a preservationist. And he preserves objects because it's his belief that what man makes man. So everything that we look at helps us understand who we are. And I started collecting modernism because modernist artists were trying to show us a new way of looking at the world. They wanted us to see things differently, so that a tree didn't have to just be brown and green. It could be orange, it could be pink. And they were trying to show us mortals, because I always put artists on a higher plane, that there was something more that existed than what we're able to see. So in all times of troubles, I come to the museum, I come to the art world to understand this world better. So let me tell you about the exhibition. It's laid out in chapters because Matthew is a literary man and a poet. And so you won't find just a steady stream of objects about a certain time period or from certain artists. It's a mixture and compilation of the two collections, Mickey Wolfson and mine. So Pursuit of Abstraction is laid out in chapters. And it is, as I said, a cultural response to the spiritual crisis at the modern times. So what do I mean by that? If you take a proletariat, a working class that's coming from the agrarian age, and you think of them sitting in this barn, and they're surrounded by clean air, and they're connected to nature, they're out in the fields with their hands, working in the environment. There's a horse, they're connected to the animals, they're eating communal meals, and they're together. And it's a really different kind of environment. And all of a sudden, the Industrial Revolution comes along, and that same worker, that same proletariat, is thrown into an age of soot, buildings, most importantly, isolation, and cars, trains, machines, cutting off fingers, and a world that is not connected to people, not connected to place, and not connected to soul. Because really, when we remove ourselves from nature and all these things that support us, we lose that soul connection. So this answers that journey of what happened between those two ages. And I will surmise to you that we are in the same position now. We are moving from the Industrial Revolution into the age of technology, which is why I hold this phone with me, and the information age. And the same feelings that they were experiencing then, we are now currently feeling. So here we go. What happens when we feel dislocated and isolated is that the first thing that the soul has to do is we need to think about utopia. So Matthew calls chapter 1 Dreamscapes. And I call it utopian thinking, because this is how we are going to envision where we want to go. You want to set intention and envision where you want to go before you go somewhere else. So we start here with this wonderful piece. So what do we see here? We see here the mind, the body, and the spirit. So the energy of mind, body, spirit coming through the female. And this is how we start the thinking. And this is how artists were trying to show us how to think in a new age. And by the way, though this piece looks like something from 1960, it is actually 1920, done in the 20s. So I want to take you over here to this image. This is an image by an Austrian, Hans Frank. And here we have that proletariat, right? That worker, and sitting on the mountaintop. So how are artists looking to help us get to the next place? They believe that through this crystal, truth would come. Through the crystalline energy, through the power of nature, you would be transported to a higher point, put on the mountaintop, and this is the truth seeker. This is a pilgrim seeking truth. Another interesting piece about this is historically, this was one of the paintings put in an exhibition that Hitler allowed, because if you look at it, it's somewhat Aryan in nature, right? And this belief of we were going to be the truth seekers. So there are many ways of interpreting all of the images in here, and what's so great about giving a tour for the Wolfsonian is I don't have to be an art history major. I can tell you my perspective. So we're going to shoot to my perspective here. But again, this idea of using crystalline forms to transport us beyond ourselves. They were a sign of positivity, equanimity. Everyone could access nature. Everyone could access the beauty and the clear thinking that came through these crystalline forms. So what we have on this side of the exhibition are these wonderful utopian images by an American-Japanese artist, and they're images of a utopian world, all built upon crystalline forms. And what we have here, this is Adele Watson from my collection, and the piece is called Protection. And if you look at it, at first it looks like sort of the embrace of two women, but it's not. If they look, they're the same, they're actually the same. And you have this woman naked in the landscape, right? Reaching out in the sense of hope, transcendence, while being embraced by this image coming out from the land. So this is really about the embrace of the higher self. So these were, again, we're in this utopian world about what is going to help us get through this next age. So thinking about the embrace of the higher self. And now I'm going to bring you back over here. This is a dualistic, what I call a dualistic canvas by Mabel Alvarez, and it's called Dreams of Youth, and it was done in 1925. So when I say dualistic, it's that we can interpret it in two ways. So there's a Judeo-Christian side of it, and then there's a Buddhist side of it. And one of the things about Mabel Alvarez is she had been meditating for about 5 years before she painted this. And unlike the modernist paintings that have bright colors, very infused with rich coloring, there's a lot of white light imaging in here. Almost like when you do a meditation, there's white light. So remember, these artists were trying to help us see things another way and interpret through their mediums, whatever they were, what was next to come. So here, from the let me take you through this, through the Judeo-Christian perspective, music and dance, eros, love, dove's peace, love, annunciation, and the three graces. So that would have been typical for 1925 interpretation. However, we know this, we have some signals that there's something else going on here more. So if we look closely at this, let's just quickly go down to here. You have this angel under the tree of Annunciation, but the angel is holding obviously something very different, and that's a lotus. And when the lotus appears, I mean, I haven't ever seen an angel holding under the tree of Annunciation holding a lotus, but rising out of darkness into the light. So if we look at this from a Buddhist perspective, there's always music and dance present. You have eros and you have the doves, or you have Cupid and the doves. And the doves in Buddhism are representative of bodhisattvas. And bodhisattvas are those that are allowed to transcend to nirvana, and they choose to stay between heaven and earth and help others ascend. Always love, both languages, all religions, all creeds, love prevails. And then, as I said here, you have Annunciation, or from the Buddhist perspective, you have this idea of under the tree of enlightenment, because there's the Buddha coming to the light, or the lotus coming up through the light. And here, the three graces, or what I like to talk to or about, are the coming to the self. Remember, she had been meditating, and you have this central figure, right? In the Judeo-Christian, maybe the Madonna, but here, again, connected to nature, one with nature under the tree of enlightenment. And you notice the hair colors in each vignette coming to the central figure. So here, we have three graces, or the Sufi tradition. And in the Sufi tradition, you know, those whirling dervishes that come through, it's a turning inward toward the heart. And that's what the artist had been doing, Mabel Alvarez. So initially, there's a recognition that something exists beyond ourselves. And then there's an offering to the self. I'm going to take the time, I'm going to take the discipline to start this meditation, understand what it is, to coming to the full self. And notice the hair color with the full offering. The hair color in each vignette means to me, and this is my perspective, that she's represented in all of these vignettes. Tulips are about rebirth, the spring, the colors green, the deer, kindness, and gentleness of spirit. So here we have this great dualistic canvas with which someone who was struggling between what she was brought up with, those Judeo-Christian things, and then what she was discovering in this new way of being. So I'm going to go next to chapter 2. Since we have this idea of utopia and what we could imagine and how we could imagine life differently, we need to think about, as Matthew calls, secret doctrines. And I language it portals, because I want to know what are the portals that we can use to get to that utopia. And this is what I think this exhibition is telling us. So these three images, which I will explore, are all by Agnes Pelton. So number one portal. What's happening in this picture is we have this bird who's talking to us. And what are we doing? We're listening to nature. So one of the great portals is listening to nature. And again, the illumination of nature and what it can bring us. But it's very, very unique to stop and listen to that. This was an image that was done in 1917. Here, another portal, Agnes Pelton gives us a little later. This is 1929. And the reason Matthew has it in this, I talk about it as creation and the beginnings. Matthew put it in here because he talks about it as the breath. It's the Kundalini breath. And so we're also exploring the senses as another way or another portal to get through. Here we're listening, here we're using the breath to breathe, and that energy that we send through us, creation, and the piece is called radiance. And to the third piece, which I'll read, and this has to do with your intuition and things that you surmise and hear, and listening to the self, coming to the self. It's called Voyaging, and it's done in 1931. The poem that Agnes Pelton wrote to this reads as follows, and then you can follow the image. High noon above the sea, looking upward blue, empowering blue, lines of power downward weaving, from which there springs a chain of light, links of the past illuminated, or of the days to come. Airy brightness of the moment held in time suspended, till above the deep, the golden bell shall sound a consummation or a change. Matthew backs up these ideas of portals with images from Mickey's collection. And here we have an image, O Mane Padre Om, right? So we're going to get there through chanting. We have the portal of initiation. Whatever road we pick, there is an initiation that happens. Here we have the way of the cross. Things we're going to change in the Judeo-Christian thinking. Here we have the light of the soul, right? Going to the soul connection. Here we have the central spiritual sun. Remember the sun worshipers. There's a big sense about worshiping the light and the sun, and then the divine breath. So these are all portals or secret doctrines way in to get to our utopia. Now another thing that was happening was, and this is what's so fun about the Wolfsonian, is there were artists that were talking about chairs and furniture. There would be another way to get us there. So this chair is influenced by Rudolf Steiner. And a lot of you had kids who possibly went to the Waldorf school, but talking about the transcendence of sitting in this chair. And I go back to that sort of proletariat or peasant that's sitting in sort of a square chair, and now there's this industrial age, and now you're being exposed to a lot more, and you sit in a chair like this. Again, check the crystalline forms. Again, using those same ideas of nature and crystal, the idea being that you would sit at this and be transported to someplace else beyond yourself. I would be more creative if I sat in this chair, I promise you. And it was part of a suite that was done. There's a desk, and then there's also a bookcase. And you can look at the pictures here that describe that. And this idea also of functional furniture coming into the conscious. And in this bookcase that's now attached to the desk, there's also a Madonna. So this idea of knowledge and craft and creativity that would transport us beyond ourselves. So these are different portals that we explore. And now we're coming through the portal. And now, this is my portal, my phone, right? Because I want to stay connected with my nephews. I want to stay connected with my mother, who doesn't even answer this. And I don't know, am I supposed to Snapchat? Am I supposed to Google, Facebook? I really don't quite understand all that I'm supposed to do. I can do part of it, but I get lost, and I find myself more and more behind a computer and more connected to my phones. I mean, how many of us are sitting at the airport? Liz, you just got back, and you're at the airport, and no one's talking to each other, right? They're on their phones and not connecting. So there's this in our age, and in their age, moving into that industrial revolution, there's a deep sense of dislocation, which is chapter 3 here. I feel disconnected and dislocated, and these artists are showing that's exactly what's going on with them as well. So here we have a perfume bottle. It's done by Lenore Feeney, and it's 1936, 1937. It was made for Schiaparelli, and if you look at it closely, there are no arms, and there's really no head. And the head is just this flower, which is great because we're talking about perfume and we're talking about the scent of things and that new things were coming through, but we're not quite connected to it all. And even the advertising of the time was talking about this, and that's why Matthew put that in there. And here we go to 2 images by Helen Lundeberg, and the top one's called Fantasy 1948, Shadow of the Rock 1947. And here's this looming rock of nature and this barren landscape with this tree. And again, no people in this. We're dislocated, right? These artists are thinking dislocation, and surrealism sort of comes before that, and then we have images that we begin to understand. And here, are we in homage of this new thing coming, or are we in fear? It's a question the artist is asking. And here we have the beginnings of a painting here that sits within the cosmos. Right? So that creative, that art world is sitting in the cosmos. And art historically, we have the beginnings of geometric abstraction, because though this isn't thrown from the lights here in the museum, this is actually painted in. And we see the beginnings of an art movement called geometric abstraction. But again, looking at this sort of this landscape that's very barren of people and very isolated and removed. Not threatening, maybe threatening, we don't know. And I come to these 2 pieces. This is called the granary. So now how are we feeding ourselves? Where we used to feed ourselves by feeling connected and connected to the earth, and of course, the breast where the milk comes from, right? It's being industrialized, right? So our source of food is being industrialized. And what is that going to mean? This is a wonderful piece by both of these are by Virginia Beresford. This is 1931, and this is 1941. And it's more about magic realism and the idea of, if you're here in Naples where we are now, or Miami Beach, and you take that shell and you hold it up and you close your eyes, what do you vision? So again, another piece of the senses coming through. You vision this world that's there. But again, no people, devoid of landscapes. And I would, let me take you here first. Henrietta Shore was this artist, and it's called Caribbean, 1925. And it's the idea, if you think of Van Gogh, who was a modernist painter, and he was painting those islands and all those women, and they were sort of working and carrying things, right? And they were naked. And here you have a woman with dignity. So this is a woman's perspective of women back at that time. Again, the stare out into the new place, and we're not quite sure where we are in the landscape. This is Elizabeth Catlett, and it's called, it's actually untitled, 1943, but this Cubist experience. Elizabeth Catlett was African American, and she was really known about talking about the African American experience. And so in this, we have that same thing happening in the age. We have the move from the agrarian world, the world of the South, up to the urban landscape in New York. And here, if we look at the images, the hat, the straw hat she would have worn, is becoming architectural. The hands are cog-like, right? Machine age, becoming work. This is going to change. And the idea of her identity and the idea of being tired, and that this world may not quite suit or have the potential of the vision that they thought it was going to have. That's what's happening there. Now, we don't know where we are in any of these landscapes, and they're somewhat barren. And I want to propose to you that there was a psychological barrenness going on as well, right? Because when we're not connected and we feel lost, you also have a psychological, you're in a psychological place where you're sort of void of, like, what direction. So these artists from Mickey's collection, if you look at them, no one is gazing at you. You're not sure where they are. And this is 1940. So think of the war, the two world wars that were coming. And their wonderful image, this is Henry Ballman Jr., and so is this. This is a canvas. They didn't have materials after the war, so this is a canvas where things are shown on both sides. And if you look at all these images of portraits, they're ordinary people. It's not the John Singer Sargent, right? That was high society. These are artists that were turning to the every man, the every person. And they're ordinary people, and what was happening to them at that time. So now we have this place of dislocation and isolation, and the way this exhibition is laid out here, I'll come back a little bit to that. But where do we go from there? How do we get out of this? Matthew surmises we go to ritual action. We change our ritual actions, or, because this is my interpretation, we change our routine. So what do? We come to a lecture at the museum. We get out from behind the computer, right? And we start to talk to each other. We're here at Artis-Naples, and we want to go to the theater. We want to go to the Wolfsonian Museum. We want to go to a lecture there. We want to go to a lecture here. We want to do yoga classes. But we want to connect and change our rooms, so our way of being, so that we can be someplace else and change into the new way. So here, they were looking at new ritual actions that had to do with Native Americans. And this last image is spiritual deep river, going to the water, getting into a boat, doing things with friends. And so the idea of coming out of that age of isolation, we got to get in contact. We got to touch each other and connect. And the last chapter, after we do that, he calls Revelation. Now, Revelation is, of course, from the Bible, and I synthesize that into artists were saying there are many ways to survive this piece that we've just coming from, and that many ways of surviving the New Age. One way is to turn purely to nature. This is a piece by Georgia Englehart. She was Alfred Stieglitz's niece. She painted with Georgia O'Keeffe. They called her Georgia Minor, and O'Keeffe was Georgia Major. This is 1926 to 1935 in there. But Georgia was interesting because she was ends up being a mountain climber. She had a fear of heights. To conquer her fear of heights, she decides to become a mountain climber, becomes one of the foremost mountain climbers. She then goes to Switzerland, where she ends up becoming a photographer. But in this image, she's showing us, like in that first pilgrimage image that we saw, you know, nature would bring us to this utopia, to this place, this not necessarily real place, but something beyond ourselves. We take our soul to the spiritual enlightenment. So some people said, yes, nature. And there are two images over here. This is Enid Bell. She's English. It's called Unfolding Cyclamen. So the return to nature, and this idea, it's done in a lychee nut wood, and this is flowers unfolding. So a lot of people, to get out of our way and age today, they're gardening. They need to connect to the earth. They need to come back. So one of the ways is like, let's garden, let's eat organic food, let's pick our herbs and get there. And Lucretia Van Horn, who also said, Mrs. Leaves, 1930, she was influenced by Diego Rivera, the microcosm, the macrocosm of being in nature. So one way of dealing with this revelation and coming to ourselves is through the idea of nature. And another way would be to marry the forms of technology. So here with Mary Swansea, 1942, we're looking at a piece called Propellers and Skyscrapers. And what I want you to be recognize in this industrial painting is that about now, Freud has been translated and in France, and this is where these painters were going to study Cubism and Surrealism. But if you look at this, 3/4 of this canvas is what's happening below the surface. So here we have the dynamism of the energy and the way she's painted this with the Cubist style, the dynamism of the propellers, the steamships, and of course the skyscrapers or smokestacks or wherever you want to go with that. But the industry and this new world would bring us to a higher place, something beyond ourselves. I will tell you, I have the clipping in my collection, and when this first came out, the review was, "Isn't it lovely Miss Swansea chose to paint petals and stems?" They couldn't go to the place where a woman would be painting these significant industrial scenes. So industry would take us. And then of course, these important pieces, which the Wolfsonian first exhibited, now here at Artis-Naples, and then I believe they're going to the Dallas Art Museum, I hope so. This is Ida O'Keeffe. And Ida was Georgia's sister, had a very similar career to Georgia, and was quite renowned. And we have just found most of the materials. There's a wonderful curator named Sue Canterbury who has found and is putting together all the materials on Ida O'Keeffe. And I believe that exhibition will start at the Dallas Art Museum coming soon. And she was quite a significant and important painter. And one of the things we found out, these paintings were, I think, dated 1942, but we found her records. We put an ad in the New York Times, and some man came through, like he's an antiquer, a junker like myself, and this man came through, and he has all of her journals and all of her materials, which actually places this piece more 1932 when it was first exhibited. So a lot of women artists at that time, they said, let's go, let's put the current date, so they think we've just made it. But really this was made in 1932, even though she dated it in 1942. So in this place of revelation, again, coming to the light, right? Because we're at sea. You just bought a boat. It's like, how do I get home, right? You look toward the light. You look toward the lighthouse. Now, there's this dualistic meaning because there are also reefs and wrecks where these lighthouses are. So you also have to be cautious as you approach the light. But here you can see the wonderful lighthouse, the building there. In here, you have the house, the steeple, and also the sailboat, and the energy of the wind and the energy of nature. So this is a combination of both those things. The energy of the natural environment of the world leading into the light and where we're going to go. So that was another way that artists said, that's what we're going to do. And then there's the place where we are now. And in this sort of Trumpian world, and Trump was elected, and people said, we want to drain the swamp, right? So we want the apocalypse. So the last piece of this is really thinking about this apocalyptic world and this idea of coming out of the deluge. And in order to build anything new, we have to decimate and erase everything. So a lot of artists were talking about that's the way to the future. And that's the world that somehow we've chosen right now. And we're 2017. And this idea of, nope, we want to drain the swamp, get rid of all the structures that no longer support us, all the people, all of the things that no longer are going to help us achieve any kind of spiritual or well-being or go to a higher place. So we start with a wonderful book here just to talk about some of the objects in the collection. This is Violet Oakley, and it's a manuscript that she did from the walls of Vassar College. A wonderful book about the apocalypse. And we have these great images from Mickey's collection, Pamela Nathan, from the book of Genesis to the epic Gilgamesh. The cataclysmic floods reoccur in many religious narratives of the ancient world. Nearly every deluge occurs divine retribution designed to cleanse the earth of corruption and wickedness, and so return humanity to the dawn of creation. So we've come through this apocalyptic world, and then I surmise, if I can get the camera to look through, both exhibitions beautifully did this design, where when you end, you are at the beginning once again. And you will go through the same cycle. There we are at Genesis, at creation, the mind, body, spirit, to think about where from this age do we go, and how do we get there again, and how do we come back to the place of the mind, body, spirit that enriches and serves us all. This is kind of where we are now, you know, and this is a wonderful image by a German artist. And I always talk about this because in Mickey's collection, there's art from all over the world. And one of the great things is, you know, sometimes we think of Germany and we think of, oh my God, the destruction and Hitler and all the things that came through, which was also there. And there were artists thinking about cultural change and revolution of cultural change. And here we have this idea of this amazing sort of melancholy scene, which may be kind of where we are now. But this artist is looking at a melancholy scene. They're images of the self, but not connected. No one is gazing at each other. No one is looking at each other. And they're in this state of melancholy and not quite there. And here, I come to, this is Grover Cole, who was a Miami artist, and Mickey's told me a little bit about him. It's called Two Men in a Landscape. It's done in 1938. And what I like about this is, again, you know, it's coming out of that world of desolation and isolation. So this is sort of father-son, and you're looking at this man, and this was the world that was created while he was there. 2 world wars. And it decimated the belief and the trust and the faith and everything. So he's looking to the future, he's looking to his son. And if we look at this image, it's almost as if he's coming out of the canvas. This artist shows this young man coming out of the canvas, armored in a new way for the new world. So I end this talk, and I'll take any questions from there, but really thinking about why do we go to the Wolfsonian, and why do we look at these images? Because they're relevant. They're relevant to where we are now. The same thing that was happening to them at that time, from the agrarian into the Industrial Revolution, is happening to us now. We're going from the Industrial Revolution into the age of information or technology. And our emotional side and our emotional beings go through all of these different kinds of things of creating utopia, and then how are we going to get there? And then we get through these portals, and we feel somewhat isolated and disconnected, and I'm not sure how it works. What am I supposed to do to get here? So I come and I try to meet with other people to learn, okay, how do I garden? How am I going to get there? Should I paint? Should I take a class? Should I go to the theater? I need to hear from the contemporary artists who are telling me what the world looks like now. And it's my love of modernism, because as I said, coming full circle, it's why I collect modernists, because they taught me to look at the world differently. So I hope this exhibition helps you to think about the world differently. I hope that it begins to create for you a way of really looking at images and objects that are identifying where you are now, and that you begin to connect to. And I thank you so much for your time. Thank you.